Okay, welcome to Ecopsychology Voices, an interview series with some of ecopsychology's luminaries. Hello, my name is Carol Koziel, and I am the founder of the Canadian Ecopsychology Network, the sponsor of the event. Linda Buzzell and I are co-hosts of the Ecopsychology Voices series, and tonight she is our interviewer. Linda has been a psychotherapist for over 40 years, and for half of that time has specialized in ecopsychology and ecotherapy. Linda and Craig Chalquist edited the Sierra Club Books anthology, Ecotherapy, Healing with Nature in Mind. Tonight, Linda will interview Peter Kahn. Linda?
Thanks, Carol, and I'm really excited to be talking with you, Peter. Peter is the editor-in-chief of Ecopsychology, which is the peer-reviewed journal of our field. With ecotherapist Patricia Hasbach, he's the author of Ecopsychology, Science, Totems, and the Technological Species, published by MIT Press. So I'm going to give a little more of your background here, Peter. Dr. Kahn is a professor in the Department of Psychology and the director of the Human Interaction with Nature and Technological Systems Lab at the University of Washington in Seattle. He received his PhD from University of California, Berkeley, and his publications have appeared in such journals as Child Development, Developmental Psychology, Human-Computer Interaction, and the Journal of Systems Software. And he has 4 additional books, all published by MIT Press: The Rediscovery of the Wild with Patricia Hasbach, Technological Nature, Adaptations and the Future of Human Life, The Human Relationship with Nature, Development and Culture, and Children and Nature with Stephen Kellert. And Peter's research projects are currently being funded by the National Science Foundation. So welcome, Peter. We've got a lot of questions for you today.
All right.
So first I wanted to check something out with you. Is Ecopsychology Journal the only peer-reviewed journal in our field? Am I correct in assuming that?
That I'm aware of. I mean, there's the European Journal of Ecopsychology, right. And somehow I've lost track of maybe you know more of that, of what has gone on with that journal.
I'm not sure, and I don't know whether it's peer-reviewed or how it works, but I think Ecopsychology, the one that you're editing, is basically a pretty important, important point for all of us in the field. So we've got a lot of questions about it.
Right.
How did the journal get started, and what are some of its current goals?
Well, I think Thomas Doherty and others were influential in starting it. It's interesting, this re-energizing the field of ecopsychology. I remember years ago being with Carol Saunders and Jane Myers at the Brookfield Zoo, and we were collaborating on a project, and we started brainstorming, we need a new field. And we tossed around all these names, and one of them was, and this was before the journal, and I said, let's get behind ecopsychology. And then I said, no, it has too much baggage. It's just, and they agreed. And so then out of that started the field of conservation psychology emerged, and trying to which I liked in certain ways, but I also felt like the name itself seemed too narrow. It's tied simply to conservation, and so I wasn't really keen on it. And then that field itself kind of went its own direction. You can never predict how things are going to move.
Right.
And then I saw the field, the journal start on ecopsychology, and I said, well, that's neat. And then it suddenly dawned on me that no one knows the history. There's no background anymore. So we can, in a sense, rework the field, except for the people that are the core people that were and still are part of the field. And at that point, that's a tricky space to work, because they say, well, wait a minute, that's not baggage, that's us. That's
Yes.
what we've been doing for decades. And now and so that's a tricky space to work. And so when I took up the editorialship of the journal, I was trying to combine, or I was trying to honor the history of the field that I think is fundamentally counterculture out of the 1960s and 1970s, that was seeing our dominionistic culture and even our scientific way of viewing the world with a heavy emphasis on thought and mind and control as fundamentally the problem, and to try to work within that system doesn't work for our field. And that became, in the old way, that would be the field of ecopsychology. And what I was, and I think this is what Thomas Dougherty and others were suggesting, is the field needs to both honor that but also move it forward. Mm-hmm. And that creates both opportunity and tensions, because what I'm trying to do with the journal is saying yes to that counterculture movement, and at the same time, let's mainstream it. But once you mainstream it, you say, let's get some empirical studies in here, and let's use traditional methods of scientific inquiry. And at that point, it's either a big tent that I'm trying to create, or there's not enough intellectual coherence for certain people. And so I think what I was trying to do, with people like Robert Greenway and others, I'm trying to welcome them and have that voice central to the field. Uh-huh. And even people like, Andy Fisher, who's still so prominent, I reached out to him and asked him to write, I think it was a 14,000 word first article of his when I took up the issue, which is basically critiquing the enterprise. And that, I think, is what I would love to do with the journal, is to have a place that is both moving it forward in a scientific way, but also very reflective and also counterculture. Have empirical papers. I would love to get more narrative work in the journal. I'm trying and I can't get the submissions that I would like. So that's a pitch for everyone to get the word out.
By narrative work, could you give us an example of the kind of narrative work you might welcome?
Sure. I just I had an essay from a person who grew up in Vietnam, and he wrote of his experiences with his father and in some sense the spirit world that his father experienced, and being able to trace his father's life with the cancer that his father had, and the ways in which then nature is playing this powerful role in his father's life and in his life as a means of connection. And it kind of weaves it weaves the narrative with that. I think it's very powerful, and I think depth of connection with nature is both. There's an empirical base to that, but there's also a spoken narrative way to convey it.
Okay, so that sounds like you really are having a big tent idea, that different kind of voices are welcome. So hopefully people listening and watching might think about, and I know you're having a special issue coming up, right, on children in nature?
Yes, yeah.
So that if anybody's interested in writing about that. Now, how do people go about actually proposing something? I mean, how does that work technically? How do they get connected with the journal?
If people, most submissions are just done straight through the online submission process. There's an article and they upload it, and then it gets peer reviewed, and it usually takes, try to have a decision within 4 weeks is what we aim for. Okay. It's also possible if people have ideas, they sometimes just email me and say, what do you think of this idea? And that's fine too, and I can give some feedback and sometimes can structure things. So I think either of those work great.
Okay, good. Well, I'm glad you're welcoming all this. Can you say a little more about how you're hoping to bring more people with a mainstream Western psychology focus into the dialogue? How in a way that group of people has not been so involved, perhaps, in ecopsychology. how are you hoping to bring them into the conversation?
It's a good question, because if you just look at what we've done with the journal, they are in the conversation in one sense, because there are many articles we publish that could equally well have been published in the Journal of Environmental Psychology.
Right.
So it's a little bit of a disconnect for me as an editor, because basically people see the journal Ecopsychology and say, well, I'm doing this work in environmental psychology and that's relevant, so I'm going to submit. And it's pretty much a straight empirical article that could be published in other journals.
Right.
And we publish some of those. But there's not a lot of crossover then when they're writing about ecopsychology itself. And so then as an editor, I'm asking them, can you tie it in more with the field? And that's part of the discourse.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, there's a bit of a tension, or it's the big tent, because if you look at our journals, ideally we would have articles that could be published in environmental psychology, but we're also having the much more like mindfulness sort of articles that are a little less welcome in other journals, even though it's empirical. Our welcoming of qualitative data is huge. And so it's, I think, an easier place to place a good qualitative paper than other journals. But mixed also with essay, opinion pieces, and narratives, and so forth. Yeah.
Do you find that a lot of people in mainstream empirical psychology don't know much about ecopsychology, or are not familiar with the basic theory of the field? The literature of it? Is it completely new to them, or how does that
Yeah, it's so varied. And it must for you as well. It depends what circles you're in, of whether people have heard the term, whether they're aware of it, or whether you need to first connect it to environmental psychology. And for some people, even that's a stretch. And then you try to talk about nature.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I can see that it's a juggling act, that you're bringing all these. You're like the concert master with the whole circus crowd right out there, and you're sort of bringing us all together within the journal.
Yes. I would like to create a very welcoming space. That's part of the peer review process is to try to bring quality, because there's so much information out there, and it's hard to filter. And I think part of what a peer review journal can still do is do that filtering process. And that's, maybe from a more counterculture perspective, that itself is a troublesome proposition, because who does the filtering? And in that way, I draw on people from the community, the ecopsychology community, to peer review. And then I also have to make the call. And so that's part of their role.
Yeah, exactly.
And I try to be welcoming of papers that are coming from perspectives that I may or may not agree with, but I'm asking, is the quality there, and is the contribution to the community there?
Yeah. Okay, good. All right. So you've answered my question about, do you accept papers from all kinds of different perspectives? And it sounds like the answer is yes.
And I encourage them.
Good. Okay. How do you envision the field of ecopsychology developing and evolving as both ecopsychology and ecotherapy become more accepted in the wider culture and around the world? Do you have any vision of where this is all going? It seems like more and more people really are getting interested in it, just in part because of the global environmental disasters we're in.
Yeah.
Where do you think we're headed with this?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. When I interviewed for the position of being editor-in-chief, and I went back east to talk with the New York editorial office, I said I wanted like 7 million readers of the journal. That's what I was going for.
Good.
I didn't know that I didn't think I was being too ambitious, but now that I've been at it for a few years, I realize I might have overspoke. I would, but in some ways it echoes what you're saying, is that I would think that this is a field that is so deeply part of the who we are and where we come from and the solutions to the problems, the very deep problems of the world, that it doesn't make any sense that it's not embedded in so many, in every, I don't know about every sphere, but in every being of us, we need this. And then how that emerges in our various life ways, that then it goes in how it will. So, so one vision, I think, is a vision that you share as well, is this pervasiveness of a changing consciousness that then pervades out. I think that needs to happen, and I don't think the problems of the world can change unless that actually happens. And so in that sense, I'm actually, you could say, well, that sounds pretty old school ecopsychology or first generation ecopsychology. And I say, yes, I think in that sense, they're right.
Yeah.
Then you ask the question, well, what does the field look like as a field? And I think that's a harder issue to envision, of what the organization, what organizational structures, and I don't know, that's another whole nother level.
Right. What I'm aware of is that we're kind of finding ourselves being first responders at this point, that whether we're ready or not, people are looking to psychology. If the problem is in our heads and the way we view ourselves in relationship to the rest of nature, then it kind of makes sense that some of the solutions are also psychological, or as you said, consciousness-based. And ready or not, it's like we're kind of it at this point. The discussions that are happening in communities and people talking to each other, I mean, these are all psychologically important issues in terms of how we communicate with each other, how we understand the problem that we're faced with. It just seems like we're finding ourselves on the center stage, whether we're ready or not. Mm-hmm. So, but let me circle back around to another question that you raised actually earlier, and I felt maybe we could go into this a little more deeply, is this whole issue of whether mainstream Western empirical psychology is part of the problem or part of the solution. And I wanted to read a quote from David Kidner, an ecopsychology author and theorist, whose book Nature and Psyche I keep reading and rereading. And here's what he said. The roots of the schism between the person and the natural world are deeply entwined within the evolution of technological society. And these same roots give rise both to the flowering of the industrial society, for which environmental problems are a potential nemesis, and to the discipline of psychology itself. Thus, there is an ideological convergence between Western psychology and industrialism that makes the former peculiarly blind to the problems generated by the latter. The world, according to psychology, is a world defined according to the perspective of a detached observer rather than as a participant. Psychology's purpose is the policing and diagnosis of any deviation. This particular form of selfhood and style of relation to the world became the grain of sand around which crystallized the European sciences, whether their subject matter was the innermost recesses of the psyche or the most inaccessible land and peoples. So I know that's a ridiculously long quote, but I was trying to pull together what Kidner is saying, that somehow our whole way of doing science is part and parcel of the problem. And since psychology, mainstream psychology, is one of those sciences, how do we deal with this? Is he just not seeing the benefits of some of mainstream empirical psychology? is mainstream empirical psychology changing its understanding of the self and how that relates to culture and the rest of nature? I mean, I'm not expecting us to solve this tonight, but I just wanted to pull that up because I've been wrestling with this. Do you have any thoughts on it?
Yeah. We in some ways the human mind has changed over 50,000 years. And I think part of the ecopsychology that is deeply interconnected and has interconnected beingness and understands that in a very phenomenological way goes way back in our evolutionary history. And then Paleolithic, 50,000 whatever years ago, we start 30,000, we start moving out of Africa, then we start agriculture, and that's the start of the Neolithic period. And with agriculture, we become we're not hunter-gatherers, and we have property boundaries, and then we get control of the food source. So now we can store food, and once we store food, now we can have larger populations. Populations grow, and with population growth become more hierarchical systems of organization to deal with the increased population. So now we have boundaries, and as this is happening, the modern mind starts changing, and it becomes highly generative, creative, and increasingly technological. And all of this is adaptive to our changing environments. And there's a part of us now that's both Paleolithic, but also now part of us that's Neolithic. And when we're castigating, in a sense, empirical science, that's an outgrowth of just who we are. And the same with our technology. And, I've done a fair amount of work with technological systems as well as natural systems. And I've brought that together in my book, Technological Nature. And the reason I've done that body of work is that is that while we're natural beings, we're also technological beings. And when we look at the craziness of what has been happening with technological growth, the exponential growth that's happening, and our minds can barely understand how fast it's changing and restructuring social life. Mm-hmm. But it's not coming from just out there, from the mega corporations and advertisers. And I mean, it's also coming from deep within our mind and our being, that we're also we're technologists, and we love technology.
Yeah.
And so we are scientists, we are technologists, mm-hmm. and we're embedded in nature. And now the problem is that it's like we're out of balance. It's almost like, naturally we love food. It's great. I love food. You love food. But they keep serving us food. Yeah. But then there's more food, and all of a sudden it's like we're sick and we're bloated, and it's like, and it's not like, it's like there's a balance with food. And I think what's happened when you set up the technology or the science move is I think there's ways of working it in a balanced way that doesn't castigate it as evil, but says, how do we use it well? And it's a little bit different than the way you set it up as, here's the problem out there, and here's us, and we have to choose.
Okay, no, that's very helpful. And in terms of technology, do you see us be possibly able to get a handle on the messes we've created and these new technological universes that we inhabit?
Yeah, that's a big one. Do you see I throw it back at you. Do you see us getting on top of the ecological problems that we've been creating? I think in part the answer is one lives a life on the one hand with a belief that we can, while there's another part of us that is highly skeptical that we can. But at least we all struggle with this.
Yeah.
issue. And I'm sure, everyone here has a way of trying to work that. And for myself, I can be skeptical that we can solve it, but I feel, and it goes back to your vision question of what the vision is of the field and of ecopsychology. And I think from a vision, we can put forward a healthy vision and try to articulate that, and maybe just leave aside the other question of will it work? I mean,
right.
Then maybe it's less needed to have that in the foreground at least.
Yeah. So let me roll it back around to some other questions that we've had from people who are attending or hoping to attend this. And there's always questions about ecopsychology and careers. So how do we see that we could apply our ecopsychological understandings to many different areas? Do you have any thoughts on what people can do? Why should they study ecopsychology?
The why study seems to me a little different than the job question. The why study is why eat, why live. I mean, it is a self-transformation, and as one transforms oneself, you transform the world.
Yeah.
And the transformation that's deeply connecting us and our lives to a larger than human world. And then the question comes, yes, I get that. Everyone of the network gets that. And the question is, but I would like to have a job that is centrally involved in this. And I think that's a harder question. And in some ways it comes back to our earlier discussion about what's the field. And I think that the ecopsychology as a field needs to get infused everywhere, but I don't know it's not large enough as a field to yet have a large organizational structure. In some ways, the journal is one of the larger probably organizational structures for the field. And I'm not seeing, I don't think any of us have really seen jobs like from Google saying needed ecopsychologist, $100,000 starting pay, please come.
Yeah, that'd be nice.
But in all these different fields, ecopsychology has a place. So Google is interested in biophilic design. And so if you have interests in architecture or landscape architecture and design, and you go into that field and you have the depth and sensibilities that ecopsychology brings, then you can start changing the field to and move it into a deeper space.
Mm-hmm.
Or I've had some research going right now with nature preschool here in Seattle, so I'm very aware of that movement is growing. 5 years ago there were 25 nature preschools, nature schools in the United States, and 5 years later now there are 250. And so that's a very exciting, transformative field, because if kids are outside all day, or for the preschool they're half days, rain, shine, snow and so forth. So that's so it's very tied to constructivist education and also tied to deep experience with nature. Now, if you're a nature preschool teacher and you have training as an ecopsychologist, I think you just do it deeper, and you have new ways of speaking about it, new ways of writing about it, and of transforming the field. So if you're thinking about a job, I think one way to understand it is trying to use the economic model of added value. Is that a term?
Yeah.
You have added value, and you need to be able to articulate it. I think many ecopsychology programs try to bring the rational mind on top of the experiential base, because you need the rationality in language to be able to articulate it to other people, what you're doing, why you're doing it, and why it's so important. And that's the added value that then makes you the ecopsychologist in whatever job you're in, whether it's biophilic design or education.
Yeah, that's a very good advice. So I'm glad you shared that one. So what about your own writing or your own interest in addition to the children in nature? Are there other things that you're looking forward to, or how you see this being applied?
Yeah. Yeah, I have a few.
Okay, are they secret?
No, I mean, I mentioned my interest in the technologies side. So I've done a lot of human-robot interaction. I've done 15 years of research on, and have led the field for a year on human-robot interaction in the International Society, because I'm interested in human interaction, human nature interaction, and human technology interaction, and I think all three need to be brought forward. And when you ask the question, one can ask the question, are humans a part of or apart from nature? Part of our discussion is focused on, we feel like we're apart from, and how do we get back in relation? Mm-hmm. But once we start developing relationships with these technological personified systems, like Alexa and our iPhones, but when these become embedded in personified, objects, robots, then our relationships will be of that form, with that. And at that point, we're going to have to argue for the depth of human-human interaction and the authenticity and how deep can we go. And if we dumb ourselves down with these systems, then we'll lose the depth of human-human. And at that point, human-human is also the ecological and ecopsychology story. So that's one large area.
Yeah.
I just mentioned one other that takes it a little bit of a different way, but in some ways it goes back to Lao Tzu when he's writing in the Tao Te Ching, for example, of a cup. And a cup is, ontologically, it's constituted both by what it is and what it is not. And so what it is it has form, but it's also the space within the cup where there's nothing that makes it a cup. And when I think of the world, I think of the world both in terms of form and the formless. And now when I do an ecopsychology move to that, and move that metaphor, and move it as a metaphor into the mind, I think of thought as stuff, as things, thought forms. And it's largely the space between thoughts where, in some sense, the unconditioned mind resides. And we are constituted both by what we're thinking, but also by no thinking. But no thinking at a very high level of no thinking. It's not going down below consciousness. It's very conscious, but it's consciousness without thought. And going back to the science problem and being out of balance is our minds are wonderful, but and thinking has been adaptive, but thinking has also gotten out of balance. We think too much.
Yeah.
And it's almost like having a cluttered room that's so cluttered you can't even get in anymore. There's no space.
Yeah.
So part of what I think ecopsychology, the power of it is that through connecting with the natural world, and particularly, and this is another area of not just domestic nature, but more wild nature. The more wild the nature is, the more it demands of us a form of consciousness where you're just present. And there's a mindfulness then. And it's not a mindfulness that you particularly have to work at. It's a mindfulness that nature just engages. And then in that way, it's maybe trying to help explain what it is that's so powerful in an interaction with the natural world. Is it create space? And now you have form and you have the formless in a very harmonious way. And that's part of, I think, of an account of human flourishing. So I've started, doing some more writing that's trying to unpack both the, as you know, I mean, the very ideas of no thought, and here it is, we are trying to use thought and words,
right,
for things that don't have words. And other things have words. If I show you a cup, I go, okay, cup, right? But if I talk about no thing, nothing, there's nothing. And yet I think it's as important as the things, in the same way that a cup has the formless as well as the form. So I think this is, for me personally, as I'm working ecopsychology, this is some of the grounding theoretically, but even more than theoretically, experientially of what I'm trying to do.
Oh, great. Well, thank you so much for sharing with us, and we'll stop the recording and have a few questions.
Thank you.